All right, guys, so here we go with our next lesson in our logic as we continue through our text here. Let me get this screen pulled up.
As mentioned before, luckily this book is just this text is very self-explanatory. That's a good thing. So mainly our job here during our little lectures will be essentially just to highlight or to continue to point things out that are, or just I should say rather to reiterate things that are made clear or explicit in the text itself, just to hopefully solidify that idea, that concept, that point in your mind. So having said that, we're just going to start chapter 3 here, the basic logical structures. Now, I think that we may have spoken a little about this in our previous lecture. So, for instance, the parts of the syllogism. We talked about how one of the most basic kinds of syllogism is just a categorical syllogism, because of course it's just made up of two unconditional premises, and then they lead up to a conclusion of the same nature, an unconditional conclusion. Or as guys on Brooks state, just three categorical statements. Your first premise, your second premise, and your conclusion are all just categorical statements. That is just to say all across the board in regard to whatever subject they're speaking of there. Now, the parts of the syllogism are going to be your major term, your minor term, and your middle term. Now, usually your major term is going to be in the major premise, and that's going to be the predicate of the conclusion. So if you're trying to find your major term, you can look at the predicate of the conclusion, and that's going to give you your major term. The second term is, of course, the minor term. That's going to be the subject of your conclusion. So if you're trying to find the minor term within the syllogism itself, you just check out the subject of the conclusion, and that should provide you with your minor term. And of course, the middle term is called middle term because it's shared. It's what connects. That's what makes it the middle ground there between the two premises. It's what links them together. So it's going to be shared between your first and your second premise, and it should never be in the conclusion itself. So you're going to have your major premise, which is going to, of course, have your major term, your minor premise as your minor term, and your conclusion. Now, your major premise is going to have what besides the major term? It's going to have your middle term. Why? Because there has to be something connect it with the minor premise. So naturally, your minor premise will have your minor term, but what will it also have? It'll also have your middle term. Why? Because it has to connect with the major premise. Now, that connection is what's going to link these two, your major term and your minor term. That's what's going to link. This is serving as the link in your argument to connect those two ideas one to another, giving you your conclusion. Now, your book goes through here and it shows where some of these may be located, where your middle term may be located. It talks about figures and moods, which are important to know and which we need to look at, and which you'll really want to check out. However, I would really like for you to concentrate on the 7 rules of the categorical syllogism. And I say that simply because if you know the 7 rules, of the categorical syllogism that have been attributed to Aristotle in some shape, form, or fashion, if you know those, then even if you forget the figures and the moods of the categorical syllogism, if you forget all of those particular combinations, you'll be fine if you remember the 7 rules, because those 7 rules, once applied to the syllogism, will make sure that the syllogism is either valid or invalid. Now, again, syllogism has to be both valid and true. That is to say, no informal fallacies. Each premise has to be actually true. However, on the valid side, the formal rules of logic will be taken care of, even if you forget the possible mood charts, the figures and the valid moods. Even if you forget those, you'll be taken care of. You'll be served very well by knowing and remembering the 7 rules of the categorical syllogism. So let's look at those very quickly. The first is you have to have just 3 terms. This is something that's also so highlighted in your Peter Kreeft text. Early on in the book, he has a little 2-page section called All of Logic in 2 pages. Check that out as well here. I think that should be somewhere in the recommended reading. I believe it is. If not, give that a look if you have time. It's a nice little addendum to what we're speaking about here right now. All of Logic in 2 pages in the Kreeft text there. So back to the 7 rules. The first is you only have to have 3 terms, or not only have to, you have to have only 3 terms. If you mix in other terms, that's what happens, or that's when we are guilty of the fallacy of equivocation. Excellent example down here that Geisler and Brooks give. Here's an example of equivocation here. And they're doing it with their middle term. Where they're equivocating is actually going to be on their middle term. And remember, equivocate just means to it means to give a different meaning to a word when you say it in one instance, as opposed to when you say it in another instance. That's what it means to equivocate. In fact, most jokes or puns are equivocations. And so when you hear someone say "no pun intended," it's usually because they just used the word in 2 different ways, or the word was being used in 2 different ways to make a joke. Almost all puns and so on and so forth, plays on words, are banking on equivocation there, using equivocation. So this example says all inspired writings are included within the scriptures. Well, Handel was inspired when he wrote the Messiah. Therefore, Handel's Messiah should be included in the scriptures. Now, of course, you see, well, wait a minute. By inspired, the first time we use inspired, you mean in the sense that God himself has inspired a text. And the second, you mean, when you say inspired, you really mean that he was motivated, highly motivated by some particular emotion or passion or whatnot. You don't mean God breathed. You mean motivated in some sense. So just because the word is the same doesn't mean it means the same thing. That's the 4-term fallacy. Now the second term, or the second rule rather, is the middle term must be distributed at least once. And again, remember when we talk about distributed, we're talking about all of a class there. Whatever the particular term is, the middle term that's being used there, you want to include all of its class at least once. That is just to say distributed at least once. Either in your major premise or either in your minor premise. It has to be distributed at least once. So look at their example. All Baptists are baptized. All Presbyterians are baptized. Well, therefore all Presbyterians are Baptists. Well, clearly we see that doesn't follow. But even if you didn't have the actual words, if you just had the letters, if you substituted, all B are D and all E are D, therefore all D would be E. You see, it just doesn't follow. If I remembered the letters, I substituted there right. Meaning that you wouldn't even have to actually know what the claim was. Just by looking at the rule, the 7 rules of logic, this one being the second, you would know that the argument wouldn't necessarily follow. And this is something we hear all the time. You hear something like, all Nazis were for socialism, and all liberals were for socialism. Therefore, all the liberals are Nazis. Well, obviously, that doesn't follow. That commits a fallacy, a formal fallacy called an undistributed middle. So anytime you hear an argument where the first sentence or the first premises ends with a particular claim, and then the second ends with the exact same claim, a lot of times the conclusion, you'll see that what they're doing there is committing the fallacy of the undistributed middle there. You've probably heard thousands of arguments, or bad arguments, I should say, like that over the course of your life. So the third rule, and they give you a figure there, figure 3.1 on page 40, that just kind of shows you why visually an image there that shows why that doesn't work. Now, the third rule is terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. And remember, if you go back in your previous chapter, it shows you the rules as to show you how do you know if a particular term is distributed or if it's undistributed. So if you see that the major term is distributed, excuse me, if it's distributed in the conclusion, but then you go back up and you see that it's not distributed in one of the premises, then that's going to be called an illicit major. That's a fallacy. It's one of a rule is broken there. And same for the minor term. If the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, then you go back up and you look in your premises and you see that it's not distributed at least once. Well, then you know that the argument doesn't necessarily follow. A formal rule has been broken. So if it's the major term that hasn't been distributed, the jargon is illicit major. If it's the minor term that hasn't been distributed, it's called illicit minor. And then just to repeat our previous rule, if it's the middle term, it's just an undistributed middle term, because that always has to be distributed at least once, no matter what sort of what happens in the conclusion. The middle term always has to be distributed at least once. That's just a standing marching order of the categorical syllogism. One of the rules there. Now, number 4, the conclusion always follows the weaker premise. I'm just going to read this here because it says, if the size of the group can't increase in the conclusion, neither can the strength of the assertion. If one of the premises is particular, some, a lot, most of, a few, words like that show you the quantity there of your term. All of those would be some, particular, obviously. If one of the premises is particular, the conclusion must be particular. So it's kind of worded slightly odd, number 4, when it says the conclusion always follows the weaker premise. Really what you want to look for, if one of the premises is particular, then the conclusion has to be particular. Just like a standing marching order is the middle term has to be distributed at least once in any and all categorical syllogisms. Middle term has to always be distributed once at least. If your conclusion is particular, it will always be the case that one of your premises has to be particular as well. Now, the negative, and following that, if one of your premises is negative, the conclusion must be negative. So think about that. If your conclusion is particular, you have to have a particular premise. One of your premises, at least one, has to be particular. If your conclusion is negative, or excuse me, if one of your premises is negative, then your conclusion rather has to be negative. So that's a way that you can very quickly look at a syllogism. If you're evaluating a syllogism and you see a negative premise, immediately, you don't even have to bother with what the content of the syllogism is. If you see that one of the premises is negative, immediately check the conclusion, because if it's not negative, you know that it's invalid. And the same goes for the particular statement. If you see that if you see immediately, without even checking the content, that one of the premises is particular, you know immediately that you can go look at the conclusion and see if it's particular. Again, remember, you don't even have to know the content at that point. You can just those rules will give you the knowledge, will tip you as to whether or not the syllogism is even valid, if it's even worth fooling with, if it's even worth thinking over the truthfulness of the actual premises. Before you know the content, if you see a negative premise, you can check to see if the conclusion is as well. If you see that one of the premises is particular, that the conclusion has to be particular, you can check those things off immediately. And in reality, that you can do the same thing with your distributed premises, or all of your terms that are distributed, including your undistributed middle term, if it's not. This is all applicable before you even examine the content of the syllogism. Don't even bog yourself down or be worried over evaluating the truthfulness of the premises when you can run through the rules, so to speak, before you even bother with those to see if the argument even is worth following, in the sense of entertaining the claims of the premise. So 5, no conclusion follows from 2 negative premises. That's just to say nothing comes from 2 negative statements. How would you get anything from that? So for instance, my wife wasn't at the party. I wasn't at the party. Therefore, well, neither one of us was at the party. Maybe that's even possibly the best you could get, but that's just containing the premise itself. So again, read over that. 6, no conclusion follows from 2 simple, particular premises. Again, good example down here about premillennialism, which is just a eschatological view in regards to the return of Christ there, and its relation to some Roman Catholics and some charismatics and so on and so forth. Good example. However, they do make a note, and I think that this is worth mentioning here, that a lot of folks just leave this out because it can't be broken. Just to quote them here, since it cannot be broken without already breaking one of the other rules of distribution. That is to say that if that happens, they've already broken a rule anyway that you should have come across and noticed. So you really don't have to worry about that rule, because if that happens, you've already picked up on one of the others that have been broken. Now, 7 is kind of, in a way, the reverse of what we had mentioned earlier. It says no negative conclusion follows from 2 positive or affirmative premises. So they give you an example, but an easy example would be something like, my wife was at the party, I was at the party, therefore no one else was at the party. Well, that doesn't follow. Just because I was at the party and my wife was at the party, it doesn't mean that no one else was there. There could have been many people there for all sorts of reasons. So you see how just 2 negative statements can't possibly give you an affirmative, or a negative conclusion can't follow from 2 affirmative premises there. After this section, after these rules section that I really want you to concentrate on, because if you remember those, if you get those down, all of it just falls into place so very nicely, even if you forget on this next section on forms, figures and moods, and the tables that they offer here to show which figures are possible. So, of course, obviously, don't skip this little section here. Read this section about forms, about your figures and moods. Look at page 44 on your figure 3.3. Look at all the possible combinations there, all the possible moods that there are. Now, quickly glance over to figure 3.4, and you see how many just are eliminated when those rules that we had just talked about are applied. If you need to, you can jump back over to page 31 and 32 to highlight if you go back, if you're looking at page 44 under moods, the first paragraph there, and it talks about the chart is to be read vertically with the top 2 characters representing types of statements, your A, E, I, and O. You can go back to page 31 and 32 if you need to refresh yourself over those particular statements, your A, E, I, O, A, E, I, and O, yes. Jump back over there if you need to refresh yourself with those. Now, again, read that, be familiar with that. But again, if you know those rules backwards and forwards, a lot of this stuff is going to take care of itself. Now, continuing to go over, when you look at the fallacies of the categorical syllogism, it's going to say at the bottom of page 46, it's going to say illicit major, illicit minor, undistributed middle, and 4-term fallacy. Now, those aren't new and additional rules that you have to learn. These are essentially just the 7 rules you already know. Well, how? Because the illicit major, you're going to catch that when you're checking your rule. One of your 7 rules is what? If a major term is distributed, in the conclusion, it has to be distributed at least once on the premises. You'll catch this illicit major there. Same thing for illicit minor. You already understand undistributed middle, the rule about the middle term having to be distributed at least once. 4-term fallacy, hopefully you've already checked for that. Do they really mean the same thing when these terms are used in the different premises? Or are they kind of shifting the meaning a little bit, when from the first premise they meant X, but over here in the second premise they really mean something different by this word? So those rules are even these rules here, or these notes are contained within those 7 rules. Now, this next section on page 47 about immediate deductions and the square of opposition. Now, this can become very, very, very bothersome and tricky, and you kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees here. As you read this section, as you go, or as you have possibly already gone through this, remember the whole point of this immediate deduction is just to ask yourself, what can I know, or what can I deduce, what can I infer right now from the statement offered without any particular argument given, without going through any specific set of rules in regards to the categorical syllogism? What's just another way to say what is already being said? So, for instance, an immediate deduction, I'm in the middle of your page 47 here, is a deduction that can be drawn directly from a statement without knowing anything else. So if someone were to say all men are sinful, Well, another way to say that is no men are non-sinful. This is the kind of stuff you would do in high school when your friend would say something, you would just say the same thing in some weird convoluted way. This is essentially what we're doing here with immediate deductions in the square of opposition. Now, of course, you can't just say it any way because it may not mean the same thing. And that's the point of the exercise here of version, of conversion, of contraposition, equivalence, contradiction, contrariety. And this is just the way, superalternation and subalternation, this is just the way of looking at a particular statement and seeing how you can say the exact same thing, but from a different way, so to speak. You're trying to get, again, that immediate deduction. Some of these are much more tricky than the others. So, for instance, your A-type statements are going to avert to an E, and your E is going to avert to an A. Of course, that's not always going to be the case. You can't just simply flip those like that. But luckily, and again, your text is just very nice, very methodic in how it lays this out. So it's going to go through and show you how all of these particular statements, your A, E, I, and O statements, how they relate to one another as far as aversion goes. They're going to show you how they relate, how A, E, and I, O statements relate to one another as far as contraposition goes. They're going to do this with each one of these. They're going to lay this out for you. And again, what is the point of this? It's just, you're just seeing how you can say the same thing in a different way so that you're not changing the meaning at all. What can you draw out of that statement? What is another angle by which you can mean the same thing, but you're saying it in a different way? That's the point of these exercises here. Now, this is also where the square of opposition is somewhat famous, or even, according to some, maybe infamous. But you'll see the figure 3.5, and it shows you how these statements, this is on page 52. Figure 3.5 is on page 52. It shows you how these relate one to another. Now, personally, I really like this this figure 3.6 because it shows you the valid inferences there, how they work. So make sure that you pay attention to those. Don't get bogged down into the flipping, flopping and inverting and then contrapositioning and doing all this kind of stuff over and over. Just remember the big picture there, why you're doing that. And then, of course, figure 3.6 is, I find is very helpful there. And of course, the classical square of opposition is helpful as well. Go through your exercises as always. All that's going to do is help to solidify everything that you've looked at here, everything that you've read. As always, any questions, you're more than free to contact through email, however else you may wish. And I'm pretty confident that you probably won't have too many questions. Again, I just have that much confidence in the text and even you guys as students. So I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy this this particular section. And again, remember, it's not always going to be this math-like in the sense of rules and all these sorts of things. We will eventually come to what I think are fun is the informal fallacies. But before we get to those, we have to put in our work and see how we flow and how we follow the official rules of logic. Again, going to benefit you in any study, any course that you take, any academic exercise, and any practical quote unquote life experience you have. You're going to be using these principles here. So enjoy them, learn them, know them, digest them. Have a good day. All right, here.